To you. We are looking forward to having a wonderful discussion with you today. When you introduce yourselves, please make sure that you also introduce the star of the show, and that those are your teachers and coaches that you may have. My name is Tom Tinder, and I'm an attorney from Charleston, West Virginia.
I'm Steve Franzik, retired professor of political science from the U.S. Naval Academy.
I'm Diana Owen, professor of political science at Georgetown University.
Hi, judges. I'm Venna Flournoy.
I'm Sonia Stacia.
And I'm Justin Goldman, and we're Unit 6 from Maggie L. Walker Governor School in Richmond, Virginia, and our coach is Mr. Sam Olmschneider.
Great. All right. This is Unit 6, and today we're going to do question 2, and I'm going to read that to you very quickly. President Dwight D. Eisenhower said, quote, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist," close quote. Do you agree or disagree, and why? And what disagreements did the founders have about a standing army, and are they relevant today? And finally, to what extent should there be an international U.S. military presence? You may begin.
In his first address to Congress in 1790, George Washington argued, "To be prepared for war is one of the most effectual means of preserving peace." However, from the very start of our nation, the size and operations of our armed forces have been highly contested.
Following trials such as Shays' Rebellion under the Articles of Confederation, the founding generation agreed that a standing army was necessary for the safety of the Union, but they disagreed on how it would be governed. At the Constitutional Convention, Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 11 through 18 gave Congress various military powers, such as declaring war, raising and supporting an army, and building military infrastructure.
However, the Anti-Federalists, driven by historical precedents of military dictators, rallied against a large standing army. Brutus claimed that it is indeed impossible that the liberties of the people in any country can be preserved where a numerous standing army is kept up. They argued for a force dependent upon state militias, which would prevent despotism and avoid massive costs. On the opposing side, Federalists such as James Madison asserted that a larger, well-trained army capable of acting without state militias was crucial, and that if Congress be not invested with this power, any powerful nation will be invited to attack us. Yet these concerns are less relevant today, as it was not until during World War II, when the size of the U.S. military increased to over 11 million troops, that the modern American standing army was born.
President Eisenhower's dire warnings of an informal alliance between the military and defense industries were insightful then and still are today. Following the Second World War, the American economy didn't convert back to pre-war norms. Rather, what Eisenhower called a permanent armament industry of vast proportions emerged. The Cold War and threats of nuclear attacks kept both defense spending and the standing army large and powerful, thus increasing the political force wielded by the military-industrial complex. This limited the effectiveness of Congress's Article 1, Section 8 authority to raise and support a military, as well as the President's Article 2, Section 2 role as Commander-in-Chief. In short, Eisenhower saw the military-industrial complex as a danger to our democratic form of government.
The fear of misplaced power that he describes in his 1961 farewell address is still one we must take seriously today. With an annual budget of around $622 billion, the Department of Defense works closely with companies like Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman to create the most advanced machinery in the world. For example, the U.S. military has purchased almost 400 F-35 aircraft, each valued at around $110 million. To put it in perspective, the price of one F-35 could build 3 high schools. The military and the arms industry working so closely is a slippery slope towards a complete autonomy from civilian oversight, as these unelected leaders sway policy decisions regarding defense.
In these policy decisions, the U.S. Armed Forces should avoid unilateral action and occupation of other nations, except in cases of egregious human rights violations. Oftentimes, costly occupation generates resistance from other nations, leading to more violence. Military occupation also greatly reduces the possibility of the host nation to regain collective self-determination once we remove our armed forces. Our occupation in Iraq, for example, led to the deaths of over 4,000 troops and added trillions to the U.S. debt, yet fighting still continues today. The consequences of occupation can compromise our military's efforts. Therefore, unilateral military involvement should be avoided except in extreme circumstances.
However, we should continue to work with Asian and European allies to launch multilateral networks to deter international problems. These mutual defense efforts allow us to gain foreign intelligence and train side by side with allied nations. With this greater political force, we can use diplomatic methods to protect human rights and to address urgent issues like education and global health.
As Eisenhower once said, we want democracy to survive for all generations to come, not to become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow. Therefore, it is necessary for the United States to take action with allies to protect human dignity around the world and prevent encroachment upon democratic values by the military-industrial complex.
Thank you. We now have some questions for you. Our recent immediate past president had an America First policy concerning international matters, and perhaps our new president has a different policy. Which of those policies do you agree with and why?
So I think that we would agree with President Biden's more multilateral policy. For example, I think that when he said that we should not only lead by the example of our power, but by the power of example, this is crucial. And so instead of during the Trump administration, in which we alienated NATO allies like the French, when we pulled out of Syria and sort of abandoned our Kurdish forces that helped us fight al-Qaeda, instead we should work together with our historical allies to shore up defense against malevolent powers such as Russia.
I would actually disagree with my colleague. I think the NATO example in particular is not where I stand on it personally. The countries that we were in alliance with weren't paying their 2% of their GDP towards that. So I think withdrawing from that specific scenario was the best decision, although multilateral approaches under the Biden administration is also a good way of going about foreign policy.
Let me ask a question in the broader context of Unit 6, and that is that in many states, legislation is being proposed to make election laws more strict. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that developed, why we're having that discussion now, and what you feel about the consequence should be?
So I think a lot of these election laws becoming more strict, and we've actually seen these bills introduced in over 33 of our states, and using their powers as delegated under the 10th Amendment, demonstrates real concern for our government, and it comes from a fear of outside authority and also conspiracy. So, for example, there were widespread claims of election fraud that were unsubstantiated, and yet they're still harmful to our nation.
After the Shelby County v. Holder decision in 2013, this kind of eliminated the pre-clearance requirement under the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which made it easier for specifically Southern states to disenfranchise more people. And because that is delegated, like my colleague said, specifically under Article 1, Section 4, states determine the time, place, and manner of their elections, it's important to make sure everyone has access to that ballot box. And we're not disenfranchising certain populations because they may be a minority or they may not make as much money as other people.
And then this gives more credence to our support for providential elections in other countries, for example, with Lukashenko's widespread voter suppression in Belarus.
Under what circumstances, if any, should the National Guard be deployed domestically?
I think it's important that we deploy the National Guard in cases where it would be in order to carry out the aim of the law and the values of the Constitution. I think a primary example of this is when Eisenhower deployed federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas to enforce the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education and ensure equal schooling rights under the 14th Amendment.
I think the president really needs to look at bipartisan issues for this matter specifically and make sure that Congress is also approving of their decision. For example, President Trump threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act only last year, and he had widespread people around him who just completely disagreed with this decision, and it didn't end up happening. But even this threat of this use adds to the bipartisan nature of our state today.
Furthermore, National Guards developed kind of out of the state militias. So after the 1903 Militia Acts and the Act in 1916 that furthered the National Guard, they become kind of quasi-state militias in more local levels. So they could be deployed in that methods, specifically with not on a federal basis, but they're more for a state basis, even though there are federal provisions as well.
Do you agree with using the United States Army for domestic activities such as security or COVID vaccine distribution? Why or why not?
I would say yes, simply because it's one of the means that the government has of going about actually implementing policies that are essential for Americans. I think using things like the Army for COVID vaccine distribution specifically was one of the best decisions, just because it was a crisis at the time and we used our resources that we had.
I will say, though, that going back to historical precedents such as Federal Farmer and Brutus claiming that they didn't want the standing army to be encroached upon the personal liberties of people, sometimes if we let that standing army come into our personal life, that may detract from some of those personal liberties since they were scared because of events like the Boston Massacre of 1770.
I think we would certainly disagree with the federal army being used to suppress public sentiments and rights under the First Amendment, as we saw this summer in Lafayette Park, when National Guard troops were deployed violently upon protesters in order for Donald Trump to essentially have a photo op in front of a church.
Your generation has lower voting participation than older generations. Do you want to talk a little bit about what can or should be done about that?
First of all, I think one of the biggest causes of this is just education disparity between rural, urban, and suburban schools. If we can greater influence education and education equity across all divisions of our regional divisions, then we can ensure that more people are turning out to the polls, especially the youth.
Specifically, the federal government in discretionary spending, around $70 billion of that is with education. So I think using that 10th Amendment, guarantee to the states and providing funds for them to have equitable resources is really crucial in this.
I think also just reaching out to the youth of America is really crucial here. I think this was effectively done by President Obama during his 2008 and 2012 campaigns. And once he was president, he really used his Article 2, Section 3 abilities as sort of that head of state to address the youth of the nation. And that did result in higher youth voter turnouts for those elections.
You talk about how the government and the military-industrial complex has become autonomous from citizen or civilian oversight. Can you give some examples of specifically how this is the case and some suggestions for rectifying the situation?
So certainly. So congressional representatives, specifically, while they are elected by their constituents, they have vested interest in these decisions. So for example, in 1962, the House Armed Service Committee was voting to appropriate around $500 million for the construction of the B-70 bomber. In this Armed Service Committee, 21 out of the 37 committee members lived in districts where the construction of that B-70 bomber was taking place. So it's that connection between the Department of Defense and the actual congressional representatives that takes advantage of the constituents and their say in the matter.
I think furthermore, we can see this sort of Gordian knot of American defense policy in which these institutions are able to sort of slip through because there's so many loopholes in our regulations. So for example, the Pentagon has not completed or passed an audit pursuant to Article 1, Section 9, and then deliver that information to Congress in the past 2 decades, and it's the only federal agency that has failed to do that. I think furthermore, we can see the failure of Congress to actually use its oversight and investigation committees under Article 1, Section 9. For example, in the past 2 Congresses, we've only seen 16 hearings on Pentagon waste, despite the fact that they've lost what we believe would be billions of dollars that we cannot actually know because, well, as I said before, that audit has not occurred in this century.
I also think the disinterestedness of Americans in just politics today plays a really big role in it. Eisenhower himself said an alert and knowledgeable electorate would be the only way to cure this issue. So when we looked at things like low voter turnout rates, which we have already touched on today, that just shows that Americans are becoming less connected to their representatives.
So then the big question becomes, how do we change the, if the Defense Department is not turning in audits and there's no oversight by Congress and there's no interest on the part of our citizens in what's going on, what should be done?
Yeah, so I think one of the first things we can do is look to actual lobbying. So Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and Lockheed Martin all contributed around over $5 million to campaigns in the 2019 to 2020 election cycle. So regulating that, specifically after the ruling in Citizens United, would be important, specifically because 81% of Americans favor a constitutional amendment that would overturn Citizens United and make sure that government representatives are held accountable and not just influenced by money in politics.
I think we can also look to the influence of the bully pulpit. Article 2 designates our executive as the head of the state, and things like Franklin Roosevelt's fireside fireside chats even had a huge influence over Americans. So I think relying on our leaders to be politically influential over our voters is really important.
I think we can see furthermore that under Article 2, Section 2, the Senate has the power to advise and consent to appointments made by the executive branch. So, for example, General Lloyd Austin, who is now the leader of the Pentagon and the Department of Defense, did not serve his full 7 years of retirement pursuant to the National Security Act of 1947, which is supposed to maintain the principle of civilian control of the military. And so when we should then advise our senators to obey by these regulations set forth in order to prevent this corruption. I think furthermore, we can look to investigation of corruption by these leaders. For example, Lloyd Austin, again, made $1.7 million in the time between his retirement and his posting as the leader of the Defense Department by being on the board of Raytheon. And so I think that if we ban high-level defense officials from having stock in major defense contractors, it would help prevent this corruption pursuant to Senator Elizabeth Warren's proposal.
Thank you. Here's the deal. I mean, you're the last group before we have lunch. Can we just add another 10 minutes? Because we're really enjoying this. Oh, okay. All right. You really did a very good job. Congratulations to you. You rolled right through your initial presentation. Sometimes, we state that initial question, and some groups will, hit this point or not hit that point or whatever. You went right down the line, just as it's stated in the question, and gave us good responses and good answers to those sub questions. So I commend you for that. And then your answers to our specific questions were very well done. I particularly want to highlight how you and I just wrote down, the America First, or the multilateral question, and the U.S. Army involvement. You gave us both sides of the particular issue, and you agreed and disagreed, so to speak, in a very respectful way. And we need more respectful disagreement in our public discourse today. And I commend you on that. It was very well done. Again, I like some of the comments you made. I particularly liked when you gave us in your initial presentation both sides of the debate that was going on between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And then when we ask you for specific recommendations for policies or changes or whatever, you were right there ready to go. And including when we asked you some questions that were maybe a little off topic as it related to the military industrial complex, but were certainly within the entire section about constitutional democracy or the unit. So hats off to you. Congratulations to you. And let me just close by saying you have certainly demonstrated today your wealth of knowledge, your reasoned opinions, and your leadership capabilities. And please don't let the We the People program be something that is over as it relates to your future as of tomorrow. Please, we need to have you stay involved, continue to be good citizens, and be our leaders into the future in your local communities in our home state of Virginia and throughout the country. Congratulations to you. Thank you and good luck.
I agree with everything that Tom has said. You did an excellent job. I was particularly impressed with your use of the Constitution and your application of the Constitution. That it was perhaps difficult given this particular question. You did a good job of dealing with that. You had some disagreement among yourselves, but that's fine. That's a question of strengths. I'd like to pursue that further, but we don't have the time to do that. But I thought you were, were very well prepared, and you did a good job of answering our off-the-wall questions as opposed to the questions that came directly from the standard question. Remember, you're in a kind of a rarefied atmosphere being part of the national finals. You've got that knowledge that is needed to move us forward. So I hope that as you move forward, you apply yourself to be a good citizen and go get them.
I would agree with everything that my colleagues have said. I really enjoyed your presentation. What I liked about the way that you kind of handled the entire process was with your opening statement, you kind of set up a number of broad areas. You didn't get bogged down too much in details as you were presenting your formal remarks, which allowed us a lot of leeway for asking questions. And then when you got to the questions, you really showed how, deeply you knew about the facts and, kind of statistical information and really were able to drill down into some of the broader concepts that ideas that you had set up in the opening. I thought that was a really skillful way of kind of managing the entire the hearing. I agree with Steve about the fact that you were able to bring in the Constitution quite a bit. It's not that easy for this question, and you really did a great job of that. Yeah, I thought that, your answers to the questions were extremely thorough, very interesting. You brought in information from a wide range of sources, so great job.
Thank you so much for taking time to judge us today. I hope you all enjoy your lunches.